and she and I have gone raised children together for years. She was a teacher of my children, and she's an amazing leader in the midwifery platform of women, national women all over the world. She's traveled, she's developed skill base, she's developed her relationships in so many different areas. So we're going to hear a lot from her. But today we're on as International Day of the Midwife. And actually, the WHO 2020 made it the year of the nurse and the midwife. So I'm the nurse and she's the midwife, and here we
She's
are.
the nurse?
She's the midwife. So, this way. She's the midwife.
She's the nurse.
So here we are. We're opening up this dialogue because it's a powerful day for me. I've had 5 kids, and 3 of them have been born at home with midwives, and I'm eternally grateful for my home births. I'm eternally grateful. My daughter, Brianna, is becoming a midwife. It's really exciting. She's gone to many births, and she's going to be an amazing midwife. It's definitely one of my inspirations of, seeing women lead the discovery of how women gave birth. And I have one short story of natural childbirth, and I know that Sushila will have many, but Aveline Kushi, the founder of the natural food industry, helped women to go back to say, you can birth naturally, without chemicals, without drugs, you can birth yourself. And at her funeral, many women said she was the one that helped me go back to natural childbirth with my kids. So that's my story of Aveline Kushi and her love for women and natural childbirth. So I'm going to hand this over to Sushila. Sushila is going to just spark you with story after story, and I hope we'll get her on many times. So she is the spark. She is the torch for me. As a woman, I look up to her as a very powerful woman in our society and our nation and our world. So thank you, Sushila, for coming on to Eco-Inspired Living.
Thank you, Lynn. I love you. And thank you for giving me the platform on the International Day of the Midwife. People all over the world are shining the light on the work that midwives do in this world. And now more than ever, midwives need to coalesce and help deal with the complex health issues that are going on in our own countries, in our own neighborhoods, in our own locale. And we also need to network and share our information. Not every country is as lucky as, or at least as technologically suited as America, the USA, where I am from, and they don't all have the blessings of learning through technology and networking that we can do through social media. So there's a big campaign going on to try to get some of the information out that we know right now about particular health hazards with the COVID-19 crisis going on globally. But more than anything, I want to thank you, Lynn, for honoring, it's Aveline Kushi, right? I want to thank you for that. It's very important for us as women involved in the healing professions, nurses and midwives. We handle, the majority of healthcare in our communities, nurses and midwives, nurse practitioners, healthcare workers, traditional midwives, nurse midwives. But it's important to acknowledge the backs that we stand on, the shoulders that we stand on. And there are so many midwives around the world that have inspired me, as well as American midwifery. Some of the midwives in America who kept midwifery alive when the medical profession tried to eradicate women carers. And some of those communities include our Indigenous communities. They include our African American community, where the granny midwives played very important roles in the healthcare of their communities, as well as our Mexican midwives. Our religious midwives, like the Mormon midwives, have done thousands and thousands of births in an era when birth was not happening under the care of women, skilled, trained midwives. Our Indigenous communities and our sub-communities kept midwifery alive. And in America, we've got we're late to the ball professionalizing midwifery. we had to model ourselves and learn a lot from our European sisters, learn a lot from our Indigenous and our traditional midwives as well. So thank you.
Sheila, when we start thinking about midwifery and all the experiences, I think some of the excitement for me when I've heard you go over to community clinics and the need for midwifery and midwives, I think we know there's a huge need. We know there's a huge uplift of C-sections in this country. As a woman that gave birth to 3 kids at home out of my 5 children, my second birth was a really trying birth. And the doctor was very forceful as a man. And it was probably I would say it was my most difficult or challenging birth, because he basically said, take Pitocin or leave the hospital. And so for me, that brings me forward to so many birth injuries, birth traumas, not that they don't happen in the home. And many women are so afraid of giving birth at home due to these fears of not having the hospital. But I see it the opposite. After giving 3 home births and 2 hospital births, I see it the opposite. So I think you should share about that, and what do you see in the industry, and how can we help you?
Then that's a great subject to talk about. We do know that birth trauma is real in our country of the USA. You know, it has been added to the manual on psychiatric issues, birth trauma as a form of post-traumatic stress. Some of that comes from over-medicalized births. What you're talking about, being told that you have to comply with a practitioner's advice that may not be evidence-based, where you're told that you can either listen and fall in line or leave and not deliver there, that's actually a human rights violation. You know, and human rights violations in childbirth and in healthcare happen along a spectrum. So there's little tiny violations, you know, and then there's bigger ones. You know, there's actually women that are coerced, neglected, refused care, where the true informed consent and informed refusal that we need to honor and respect the rights of birthing mothers, you know, are sometimes violated. So human rights in childbirth is a very important issue and subject, and they are being addressed all over the world. We are trying to address respectful care. We want every woman to get the care they need when they need it, and we want women to not be overtreated and over medicalized when they don't need it, because we know that that can lead to a cascade of problems. It can be a very slippery slope, and we know that incidents of operative births are increased when you start that slippery slope of medicalized birth. Now, that doesn't mean that we as midwives don't work in high risk settings. There are midwives that work across the spectrum on this planet. There are women that work, you know, because their mothers brought them to a birth and they're village midwives. There are midwives who work in countries where midwives work in secondary care with women that have comorbidities, co-illnesses. So midwives are working across the spectrum. And what we're hoping, you know, that midwives remain aware of the human rights and respect that are needed across the spectrum, and that women are at the center of their decision-making process. Women are at the center of their persons, you know, birthing persons are at the center of their care, and informed consent, you know, is based on education and giving, you know, risks versus outcomes, you know, risks versus informed decision making. So thank you.
Yeah, that informed decision making is a real slippery slope. I've watched it so much as a nurse and in the field of health and healthcare, and you know, Torch Health is really about that, is bringing a larger circle than you and your doctor into the field of health, because I think it's a really important piece. I want to say that, you know, I was getting this memory through that we marched in Albany for midwives, and I don't know what year, but I bet you do, and I bet
Yes.
you know all about that. But all of our
Okay.
kids came with us, and
Yes.
we
Yes.
marched for
Yes.
midwives, and we've done this a couple of times, and it's a huge history
Mhm.
that needs
Mhm.
to be told, and it's
Yes.
a
Yes.
history that
Thank you.
needs to be brought forth.
Thank you. So, all around the world, I think midwives have had to fight for the right to be autonomous practitioners, and particularly in America. Like I said, we were slow to the ball to professionalize midwives here to honor the fact that birth is a physiological process and that we can limit mortalities of mama and baby by the way we care during birth and try to honor the and guide it in a physiological way. Um, so what you're talking about is one of the many things that we've had to do in America. Um, the personal is the political. Where you chose to give birth, many women choose to give birth at home in a time when there were no or very limited access to women who were skilled, trained, or certified to give birth. So women in our country developed networks of training and collaboratives to become um, a profession. We modeled ourselves, we developed our own models and competency standards. And in doing that, we have had to dismantle the policies and legislations that have said that women don't belong at the helm of healthcare provision. There was no or very few specifically women-centered healthcare professionals in this country for decades, and the revolution that brought midwifery into our homes and our communities has been a hard one. Midwives were considered outlaws at one time, and here I want to honor that we have different types of midwives, like many places. We have those of us that believe that midwifery is a profession separate from nursing, and then we have those that have gone through the nursing credential and done an add-on and become nurse midwives. Both are very needed and very important. But my credential is the direct entry way. I chose consciously when I did decide to become certified to pick a model that was designed by midwives. That the model of care was, a midwife designed model, rather than a model that was based on learning in a hospital setting that was structured through the physicians and obstetricians who had dealt with birth in a medical way for decades. So yeah, the getting back to the story, with going with our children and carrying our signs to the Albany, New York courthouse to stand up for the rights of women to birth where and with whom they choose. The rights of midwives to have trainings and certifications and authoritative knowledge as Indigenous women, as well as traditional midwives as well, to attend other women in birth. So that was a particular woman who was having trouble coming up against the policies that were limiting and not allowing midwives to attend women in their own homes. So we got the kids together. I remember we made shirts, we made signs, and we went out, about 20 of us, to that. And my whole life, my kids, I, like Lynn, have 5 children. My kids have grown up going to this kind of activism. We've been very instrumental, the direct entry midwives in this country, as well as the nurse midwives, but we were very instrumental in working on legislative processes that allowed our system to change. And the thing about us that are the direct entry midwives, the certified professional midwives, is rather than working in the system, in the medical system, we worked outside the system And we said, we're going to identify our competencies. We're going to identify what constitute care. We're going to look at, research on what's best for mamas and babies. And then we're going to bring that into our skill base. And then we're going to develop didactic and clinical trainings to train women to do this. So that's the way we changed the system, because we just said no. We said no to birthing in a hospital room where husbands or partners weren't allowed. There was even partners who handcuffed themselves to beds in obstetrical units because they refused to be separated from their birthing partner. So this was the time of great activism back in the 60s and 70s. It's an ongoing struggle across the world, particularly in America, to get policies that favor mothers and babies and midwifery professionals. The nurse midwives who have worked within the system and brought the model of caring into the hospitals have my deepest respect. We are working together. We are not in competition with one another. There was a time when it was like we were considered like posers or lay midwives. But this has changed. And this is the beautiful thing about WHO's declaration that 2020 is the year of the nurse and midwife, because it recognizes nurses as healthcare professionals all around the world, and it recognizes midwives, because there is something in between. There is something beyond. On that spectrum of certified professional midwives and nurse midwives, there are skilled birth attendants, that are needed in all parts of the world where they can't go to these long courses of midwifery because there's no access, right? So, yeah.
I remember that day so vividly. And I think I remember it. Junsei was there, and I had met her through Micho and Aveline. She had showed up at the Kushi Institute, and then she appeared on those steps when she was drumming her drum for peace. And it was just amazing that day with all of us. And it was a big gathering. It was a very professional gathering. And Brianna was just talking about it, about how much impact nurses can have in the political understanding. And as a woman that really, I'm so grateful for my home births. I mean, I had one baby in a tent.
Yes.
And the complications that can come are really significant. And I think the trust of how to birth in a way of being a woman and knowing how to birth, I think for me, if I look at my hospital births versus my home births, I could trust my intuition as a woman how to give birth. And I learned how to give birth and how to do my own sound. And by my fourth baby, I had just a powerful birth, and my fifth baby. So the gift of teaching, I want to hear more about what have you learned about just women birthing? I mean, you've done the Red Tent, you've done all these amazing women gatherings. She's being very humble here, folks, but she has been at the leading front of a midwifery conference that happened 2 years ago with women and Indigenous women. And my daughter and I came to San Francisco and saw that event. It was just an amazing journey that you've had. And I think some of those stories would be really fun. And, what's the spark in you that, you've been to thousands, I don't know how many births, but let's hear a little bit more of Sushila in this.
Okay, thank you. So, I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I started attending births when I was 19 years old. I was a teen mother with a 17-year-old that birthed in a hospital, strapped down in restraints on my wrists, and my legs were restrained. And it was considered a natural birth. I birthed without medication. There was no midwife in my town. I did try to find a birth attendant because I did hear about home birth, and I was denied that. The only woman attending birth had been to about 10 home births, and she was not willing to take on a young woman like me. Actually, she was in nursing school, but I think it had to do with my age and like, oh, wow, this little girl doesn't know what she's getting into, right? Well, so I trained in natural childbirth techniques, breathing, stress management, using a focal point in the room to focus on when the intensity of labor came. And I learned to just kind of put my mindset in the space of birthing naturally and trusting my body. And I didn't have any real reason not to trust my body. My mother had 9 babies, including a set of twins and a breech, and they were all natural. No, excuse me, they weren't all natural. They were all non-operative. I didn't have any reason to hear about birth trauma. We say that can be passed on. There can be a birth script that you get from your mother if there's been trauma in your background. If your mother's had a loss, if your mother's had problems. And I didn't get that birth script. So even despite that horrible condition, which is a human rights violation, to be strapped down while you're birthing, I had a profoundly transforming experience. I felt triumphant pushing my own baby out. And I wasn't allowed to hold my baby. I brought a baby with me. My baby was born, held up, and taken away. And I had to sneak my little hand out of shackles to touch the baby next to me. That night in the hospital, the rooms were full, and I was required to sleep in the hallway on a gurney. When I got up to urinate, because I was alone on the gurney, I passed out and I had a hemorrhage. And I woke up to the nurses waking me up and hearing an old spiritual in my head being called back. Needless to say, I moved on. I got the room with the baby with me called rooming in, and I breastfed, and I was lucky enough that somebody took me under their wing in the breastfeeding movement called La Leche League that recognized in me a profound love and devotion to mothering and women. And they set me up and trained me and sent me to a pivotal conference where I met the great Suzanne Arms, who wrote the book Immaculate Deception. Look that up if you haven't heard about it. And she hooked me up with one of the very first midwifery courses in the San Francisco Bay Area, the underground midwifery courses. And her name was Donna Ha. And Donna was trained by she was trained by a European midwife. And we studied out of European midwifery books before our own midwives wrote American midwifery books, and before Varney wrote the nurse midwifery book. So that's one of my stories. I am called to bring to women what I didn't get. I felt terribly isolated as a teen mother. I broke a lot of taboos. I can't stand it when nursing mothers or new mothers are isolated, alone, and not supported. I just don't have any tolerance for it. It hurts me so bad. And I will, move mountains to try to make a little bit of difference in the lives of the women in my community. I don't have thousands of births. I am a community midwife. I've worked in urban and suburban areas where I had a higher volume practice. I've worked in rural midwifery where there's very few home births. And because of the lack of access to insurance coverage, it's very difficult. I end up subsidizing a number of births. I end up, subsidizing a lot of care in my earlier days. And now as an elder, I do need to think about other ways to practice. I am involved in global midwifery. There's no doubt about it. I was in New Zealand for over 3 months as an interim midwife. That was a very stunning and amazing privilege to be one of the few CPMs that had got to enter into that system. My credential didn't match at all what I was being asked to do in a hospital. And I did see some human rights violations going on. And I decided to come back to America and work in my own country and do what I could in my own country. So some of the things I do are not just as a midwife, attending births. I work in many areas. Like, I think it's a little bit confusing for some people to think that midwives just deliver babies, because they don't. You know, some midwives, especially nurse midwives, do well woman care. They do care for menopausal women. You know, there's a lot of different things that midwives do, and midwives are often the first responders in natural disasters. And I have become a responder in disaster or emergency situations on several occasions, and that's one of my biggest loves, is going where the resources have been disrupted and people need care. And so my goal now as a elder midwife is to become part of a global midwifery training program. I'm looking at a program in Mercy in Action, a very important midwife, Vicki Penwell, who has been addressing competencies for midwives, cultural competencies for midwives, and been working with low resource settings and helping women. She does free care for women all over the Philippines. And it's Filipina midwives that are at the helm of her care. So yeah, I'd like to travel. I'd like to get this diploma degree in training midwives and in other countries. And I'd like to travel. I'd like to go to Vietnam, where I have a son who lives. I'd like to go to Pakistan and see some of the good work going on there. And yeah, there's a number of places I'd like to go.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, you know, when I look at um, my love of mother and child and the midwives that have been involved in my care, um, you know, I came out of some pretty intensive birth trauma as well as birth relationships. You know, the daddy of my relationships. And for me, I've watched you over these years be such a powerful, powerful person in the witness to women, but you're greater than that. And I think, I guess I want to hear from you in the last, you know, we'll stay on maybe another 5 minutes, but I want to hear, what is it that inspires you to be able to inspire other women to become midwives? And what could you endorse? Because I see you as that trainer. I get that you need to have another certification, but you're such a leader in the midwifery for me.
Oh, thank
And
you. Thank
yeah,
you.
and I really feel like you could bring together the skills. And what could we do to support you to do that in a way that you could really be out there training midwives? Because
Thank you.
your
Thank
skill
you.
is from a deep spiritual skill.
Yes.
And
Yes. Mhm.
thanks. So please.
Appreciate that. Yes, I have been a teacher of midwives. I have done direct apprenticeship of several midwives, very short apprenticeships, because my first midwife collaborative, um, they, you know, one of them, you know, just kind of surpassed me and became my partner, Susan Moradian Kappa, amazing midwife. And, you know, she's now a nurse. She moved into nursing and hospice. But I have done apprenticeships. I've also done precepting. North American Registry of Midwives, we have a process for this credential. Like I said, this is a model of care. This is a rigorous and trying journey to become a midwife. It requires a lot. It really does. It requires everything. And I have done non-precepting at several birth centers, including Maternidad La Luz in Texas, which has been a leader in direct entry midwifery. They have done over 10,000 births in the birth center, all unmedicated. Yes. Yeah. I've also worked at Birthing Your Way in Utah. And then, of course, I've worked down on the borders in other types of care. But this global diploma is particularly for training in low resource settings. Yeah. Yeah. So that interests me. Thank you.
Yeah.
How you could support me, I do need to find the funds to do the program. I thought about putting up a GoFundMe page, because some of the textbooks, some of the books are expensive. You know, the program is actually, I think, within my reach. We'll
Good.
see what happens with the whole COVID thing. Right now, I'm in a very small rural area of Massachusetts, and I'm staying home and trying to just be present in my community. I'm considering a birth home where someone comes into a freestanding space that I have on my property and they can birth there, not a birth center that handles a large clinical caseload. This is like one birth a month because, for one thing, we have a low birth rate here, and the other thing is that not everybody wants to give birth at home. Some women like to leave their home because they have family members or children, or they want to be somewhere where they can be more private. So we do have birth centers in this nation that are freestanding and not a part of hospitals, and I've worked in them. The policies here in my state are not very good for birth centers, and I've been working on legislation, not legislation, excuse me, that's way too grandiose. I have written to all my legislators trying to promote a pop-up birth center for the CV-19 crisis, and I haven't gotten very far with that, but I am going to continue to be hands-on primary care. I'm not letting that go. Teaching is something I really love. There's no doubt about it. Thank you, Lynn.
Abbas mentions, such a beautiful, strong soul. Sushila, you're a standing, your sturdiness in the world, your sturdiness as a midwife, your presence to women, and just the gifts. I want to share an outside story. Sushila was a homeschooling mom like myself. We both had 5 children. I was going through a lot of changes in my relationship, and so I went out of the home for the first time to work because our home needed money. And Sushila took on the wings of raising my kids and really took on a really powerful act and role. But I never felt more than, there were probably 6 women in our groups circles, and we stuck together, but there was something deep and rich about the rawness of birth, the rawness of women, the rawness of today's day and age that I don't feel is being seen in a healthy way. And I really want to say that with the way we raised children and the way we were with each other and the way we created what we created for our kids, it's a really important thing to know that women have a different way of being in the world. And we've been looking at business partners, and I've been talking to a lot of women recently about, like, how do you build a business around a woman's idea of business versus a man? And it's very different. It's very different. And it's deeply important that we start taking a stand for just being in the rawness of being a woman. It's a powerful reach. And I think in the midwifery, we see it, the women that are able to birth naturally, they're able to birth in the rawness of their own soul and use their voice and use their, whatever they need to do to be able to be in the birthing moment, to let that be. And I just was at my 4th grandchild for my son Adam, and I was at the hospital with her birth with my daughters. 2 other daughters were there, so there were 3 of my kids and myself and the other grandmother from Brazil. And I just helped her just breathe from her mouth. I breathe and make the sounds, and it didn't matter. Like, just be in the rawness of the woman. And I really believe it's something that and you have been a teacher of mine and a teacher to my children. And I just really love your spirit there. And I just want you to, really stand for that in the last few minutes of this conversation. And how can we help women just to be women in birth? How can we help to let women let down their guard? And women, even in the business world, don't let down their guard. They're like becoming men in the man's world to be business women, and it's not who we are. It's not. And I'm really clear about that right now. So I'll let you share about that. I probably went on a little bit, but I'm just like,
no, I appreciate your sharing. I don't know if there's much time, but I will say that it's really important to understand the physiological process of birth. It's really important to address past trauma. You know, there may be traumas that are not birth related. It may not be from a birth script that somebody learns because their mother had a bad time or their mother was lost even in childbirth. It could be another trauma that impacts a person giving birth, you know. So the role of the midwife is continuity of care. We are carers. We see you regularly. It's different now because we have to change our care up a little bit with the COVID-19. But we build a relationship of trust and partnership, and then we look at what is it that we can do to help this person give birth in a way that their prime neurological hormones that are part of their neurobiology are active and going to help them deliver a physiological birth while monitoring for, you know, the important safety in labor and birth. Now, there are women with comorbidities, there are women with high risks, and we can find ways to bridge the gap and, you know, and bring this model of caring, this model of power, empowerment, this model of, you know, being with whatever is, whether it's the power and glory and pain and triumph of giving birth naturally, or whether it's the power and strength and courage it takes to deliver in an operative setting or in a refugee camp or, you know, in a car because you're on the way to the hospital. You know, we want to be able to try to bring that to women, to persons, you know, everywhere. And I think it's a larger discussion. You know, maybe we'll have it another time because we do know so much in this past decade of brain research that really there are optimal things that prime our brain for giving birth. And, you know, we know that. You know, we know that we want to have an oxytocin rich environment so that the uterus contracts like it should. She's not afraid. She's got soft light. She's got an environment where it feels safe to birth. Safety is really important for a birthing woman, whether it's in the home, the hospital, your ocean. I mean, I've been to an ocean birth. Yeah, that's another story. I mean, I don't know why I brought that one up, but yeah. So I hear what you're saying, this concern that, you know, there was something that came up, and this sounds very judgmental, but there was a very famous pop star who elected for having a cesarean, and the quote that came out of that was "too posh to push." Right? Too posh to push. Some women elect for cesareans, and it isn't because of a medical reason. Um, you know, we might argue that that's okay, especially if there's a trauma. But you know, we know that cesarean births cause more blood loss. We know it sets a woman up in her future births for problems. We know it's a surgical recovery. We know it impacts breastfeeding, you know? So, like, how do we inspire persons who are birthing to find the strength that comes from being primal, you know? And how do we set up the environment so that maybe there's just the natural process and the baby is just ejected and comes, you know, because that has happened in many parts of the world. There's something that Michel Odent labeled the fetal ejection reflex, where when all the settings are right, when the baby hits a certain, when the baby hits a certain depth in the pelvis, it triggers the brain and the increase in contractions, and boom, the baby comes, right? And it isn't prolonged, it isn't obstructed. So that really depends, though, doesn't it? I mean, that really depends on the pelvis. It depends on the position of the baby. It depends on the passage. I mean, we know that, you know, I could tell you more. I mean, we know that being active in labor is really important. You know, we know it's not good to lay on your back all during labor. It's going to cut off your oxygen flow. It's going to cause the gravity to be an upward, you know, an upward effort for the baby. So, yeah, I guess bottom line, it's knowledge. Knowledge is power. Support, like really helping deal with mental health issues. Like, I think right now it's really hard. It's really hard. There's a lot of fear and anxiety because there's a pandemic going on. And this is unlike any other time globally. Yes, we know that many countries have had pandemics. We know that there's been war, there's been ravage, there's been global um, natural disasters. So persons have had difficult time birthing, stresses. But that's one of the things we need to do, Lynn, is look at the mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, that heartfelt idea of holding a woman in that space, in the vulnerable space, is so important. And I think when you've opened those doors to be able to know that, that deep primal essence of the feminine, I'm praying. I'm really glad you put the name primal, because birth is primal. Birthing is primal. Birth
Yes.
is,
Yes.
it's a natural order of life, right? The women.
Yes. Yes. So
And
Lynn, like, there's almost like two parts. Like, I'll tell a
yeah.
woman when she's laboring, there's that part where you almost have to be receptive
Mm-hmm.
and somewhat passive, because this incredible force is
Yeah.
working to open your body, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to get out of the way. You
Yeah.
have to move, you have to rest, you have to hydrate, you have to conserve your energy,
Mm-hmm.
you have to mix it up. But then there's that part where you have to you have to allow in the fierceness,
Mm-hmm.
allow the fierceness that's like, you know, you
Yeah.
have to not be terrified by this sensation that's moving down into the lower forces of your body, where you've never felt that kind of pressure before,
That's right. That's right.
nor will you. And you have to greet that and understand that as this is birth working. This
Yeah.
is the baby descending. This pressure, you know, this pressure in the back that you feel so bad, this pressure in the hips so bad. And that's why we push on women's hips. That's why we get them in different positions on their hands and knees, so that this part that you sit on, the tailbone, takes the baby off. So, yeah.
Oh, there's so many stories I want to talk, and I just appreciate
Time.
so much. I appreciate it so much coming on with you, because I know
Thank
we have a lot to share. We've been in women's circles for years. We've been in,
you.
we were just in one in Fairfax, and we both showed up at this women's circle, just serendipitous. And we both shared, and the women were kind of like, who are these two women? And we both felt it. We walked out and said, we've got things to share. And so there's time ahead, and I look forward to it. And I'll give you the last words of, this International Day of Midwifery. And what do you want to share with the world with this global platform? And I also want to invite you to the Eco-Inspired Living, on the Eco-Inspired Women's Entrepreneur Day, which is May 31st. And then we're doing an art day, which is going to be a weekend. And I totally would love women and art about women and art about giving birth. And like, we should just like come up with this theme and like create an art around birthing, because it's so precious. It's so
We've had a birth art display before here
Woo!
in town. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So thank you, Lynn. I appreciate that. I want to say that, midwives work in collaboration with other professionals. We have great respect for, obstetricians and gynecologists. We like to work in collaboration with them. We like to give collaborative care. We want to coalesce with all the stakeholders that are working to improve maternal and infant outcomes in my country and others. I want to tell all mothers and all midwives that I admire you and your courage. It takes courage. It takes courage. And I just want to send that out to all the families right now, to keep your courage, find your courage. When you lose it, do what will will make you feel courageous, and let's get through these times, and let's address the deep needs and the deep disparities in this country and in this world, so that all mamas and babies, all persons giving birth, can have access to good care and fresh water and good food.
Awesome. Awesome. Agreed. Agreed. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for coming to Eco Inspired Living. I really pray that you and I spend some time. We've also got a show that's kind of underground that maybe you're interested. It's called Divine Mastery Within. And it's really about smaller groups and really developing that. And so there's another sister from here that I would love you to meet. And I'd love you to explore growing that with us. And
All right.
that divine mastery within as a midwife, I know you will bring huge value to so many. And I thank you for being my sister.
And thank you.
We've been amazing single moms together. We've been homeschooling moms. We've been, on the front lines supporting midwives.
Yes.
We both worked really hard for our degrees because we've had kids
Yes.
and gone to school.
Yes.
Like both of us have gone through such deep, deep passion to be able to say the health of people is really important.
Yes.
And on this day that who brought forward the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, I believe that we as women that have taken on that role, and men, that can move forward in the creative aspects of what does that mean to people, and I highly respect you. I highly respect you as a deep, compassionate sister in the world that so many women should look towards and look forward to, and get guidance from Sushila because she's powerful. So if you're pregnant and you want some, relationship connections between what is natural childbirth, what is a hospital birth, these are the classes that I would love to see with you, with me, and with us. And really, what can we discover in supporting women to hold that space? Because we've both held a lot of women, and we've both had a lot of women in our circles to hold, spiritually, emotionally, physically. And thank you for birthing. You've birthed me. I think I've birthed you. We've birthed each other.
Of course you have.
Yeah.
You're so inspiring. Thank you. You've
we've
widened the world for me. Yeah.
We've birthed and birthed and birthed, and we'll continue to birth as women in a society of people that come from this wonderful place called Mother. And
hey, it's gonna be Mother's Day here in this country soon. So
yeah.
happy Mother's Day, and I'll sign off with that because I can see that I've got a next thing to do. A wonderful next thing.
Oh, good! Yay! All right.
My daughter-in-law is around, so I want to get her. Much love to you, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on this International Day, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Much love.
Us. Blessings.
Thank you so much, people.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back again. We've got some wonderful experiences moving forward. We've got some great shows coming up. The Women Entrepreneur Show is starting, so look for us, and we're embracing tremendous amount of gifts of eco-inspired living. How do we live a better life for the next generations? Bless and peace, and let's bring it forward so that all people can live with abundance, with love and kindness. God bless you. Have fun today.